Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show how I painted this dog with a scenic type background in acrylics. Now the tips and techniques that I share in this video and how to blend acrylics can be applied to any kind of background. My first tip here is to apply some kind of colour to cover up the white of the canvas. Now because the background here at the top was more of that lighter blue, I have just picked a mid to light blue to start with, and then I can start building in my lighter and darker blues from there. Now when blending backgrounds or larger sections of acrylic paint, using a fine mist spray bottle is my preference. However, that's one additional tool that we then need to get control of throughout that painting process, and when newer to acrylics, it's something there that can complicate that layering process just a little bit further. So what I wanted to do for this project is show in the real-time tutorial, which that version is all linked in the description below if it's of interest. I wanted to show here how you can then use more of a controlled technique and have more of that flexibility with when and where to add that water to then blend that layer of acrylic paint. So what I'm working with here is that foundation of the blue, and then I'm going to start to add in my additional colours, whether or not it's my lighter colour or my darker colour, and then I'm going to blend that into a layer of water that I've applied first of all. I'm then using more of that smaller yellow handled filbert brush to then blend or soften the edges of the wet paint into the layers of water that I've put previous. Now depending on the effect that needs to be created, how much water that is going to be applied will vary. If you're working with more of an outer focus background, then you'll need to be using more of these techniques and a little bit more water so that that paint can be blended a bit quicker and definitely more flexibly. Now when using this technique, regardless if you're using a brush to apply the water or a fine mist spray bottle, if there is not enough water over that area where you know you're going to blend, and you come back in with your blending brushes and smudge the edge of that wet paint, if it hits an area of dry canvas, it's going to create a harsh edge. Then what happens is you start to have more of a ring around the outside of the area that you're trying to blend, which of course is not going to give us that outer focus effect that we want. So if that is happening, it's usually because there isn't enough water over that area. So you want to make sure that you're applying it in a bit more of that larger section first before going back in with your blending brushes. Now one other thing here that's really important to remember is the initial stages when working with acrylics, especially when we're trying to create an outer focus effect, they don't look great early on. This very much is a layering process. Now even here where I've got that darker section of that turquoise blue colour, where I'm now adding below it this brown section of that scenery, those two edges there look very harsh, but I'm going to fix that later on in that layering process. This is definitely one of those times where we need to just work on one area at a time and one of those techniques initially. If I try to capture all of this being out of focus, I'm going to have to use a fine mist spray bottle so that again I can keep that paint wet for as long as needed. But when we're trying to blend acrylics without using that tool, if you're newer to a medium, this, as I've mentioned a moment ago, gives us a little bit more flexibility with what we need to be blending initially. It just means we can work in a bit more of a smaller section, which can make blending acrylics less overwhelming. Now as I'm starting to come back here and hinting a little bit more at the sort of texture within this background, I want to be making sure that I'm still following the lights and the darks. Now the placement of the highlights and shadows here is going to of course follow that overall light source. So when I'm blending my paints, I want to be making sure that I'm still following my reference photo and that I don't over blend. Now when I start to put in more of my lighter sections, you can see that it's a little bit more in those sort of rows, and that's going to help for me to build up that scenery in the background. I want to be making sure, just like when I'm painting fur, that I'm following the direction of the way that fur moves, the feathers. It's exactly the same with the foliage or landscape. I don't want to start moving my brush in different directions because that's going to give me a different texture. Now when I work with blending acrylics, I always recommend that if there's a layer that you really like the look of, to make sure to dry it before you add another layer. What this does is it just means then that we're not as likely to remove that layer of paint by working with a blending technique that may not quite be what's required at that stage. Now, when we blend acrylics, it can be very easy to then get carried away, especially if we start getting the results that we want. So if we start to overwork an area, if that paint is wet, it will end up overblended and far too soft. The colours could potentially mix together in a way that we don't want. So you can see at this stage now where I'm starting to lighten it and again soften that white section in between the top section of the landscape from the bottom. I needed to make sure that my layers underneath there had dried before I went in and adjusted it. Just to make sure then that if I made any adjustments I didn't like, I could just simply take a damp brush and remove that layer of paint. This again gives us that flexibility when working with acrylics, that if we do something we don't like, we can lift it from that canvas. We don't have to then be stuck with it and try to paint over it and fix that issue that may have arisen. And again, this is all something where we can adjust this later on. It doesn't all have to be worked on at this initial stage. Now, I do always recommend to get the background as near to completion as possible because it's much harder to work around the subject if we do need to make major changes to the background. But just working with adjusting the colour or adding a few smaller light and dark sections can definitely be worked on once the main subject is painted in. Now, when it came to working on the dog, I'm following the same structure that I like to use if I was painting on a larger scale or if I was working on this 8x10 size, but just painting the head and shoulders. So I start off with the eyes. Once I've got those in, I can then start with the fur. Now, the only difference with this painting is because I've painted the entire dog, I'm working on a bit more of a larger area and blocking in all of the face at this initial stage. If this was a head and shoulder portrait on this size where the face is going to be significantly bigger, then I would be working on much smaller sections. I just personally find that I'm not going to rush those layers as much as I might do if I work on whole individual layers, which is why I've only just painted the face. I'm going to then work with this before I move on to the ear, rather than blocking in my base foundation for all of the dog. Now, of course, this is very individual to each artist. There's no right or wrong way of working, but if you do feel like you get overwhelmed, then working on larger sections can cause that. So just scaling it down to one area at a time can have a big impact to how that painting comes together. Now for this is a base foundation and I put a lot of emphasis on this initial stage. As I come back in here with this second layer, sort of 2 or 3 layers in, I only am really focusing on where I'm placing my lights and my darks and getting that base foundation dark enough. Now as I come through with my smaller detailed brushes, this is where of course I'm starting to hint at that fur direction and the initial fur texture. So I start to have to consider the fur length, the fur thickness and the fur direction. Now just like the placement of the highlights and shadows, the fur direction is not random. It follows the underlying bone and muscular structure. So I want to be making sure that I've captured that as much as possible. Now when an area of that painting, like the size of the dog's face, is significantly smaller, we're not able to add in all of the fur directional changes. So on a painting like this, I just want to pick the main ones and then focus on those. Now throughout many stages of this painting so far when working on the face, you can see that I've adjusted the colours at different times. The paint that I add for these details here is significantly lighter and not the right colour. Now that's deliberate, and this is one of the wonderful things that I love about this medium. We can break this up into 2 separate stages, so we can focus on the details, the way that we need to block in that fur, get that fur direction and the fur length right. We can then wait for that layer to dry and then work with a glaze to adjust the colour. Now the way that we use glazes is going to vary depending on the effect that we need to be creating, but I do have a video here on YouTube that demonstrates the main uses for glazes and how I like to use them in my paintings. If that's of interest, I'll link that video in the description below. Now while I was waiting for the base layer of the fur to dry, that's when I can work on a few alterations to the face. It just means then that as I'm slowly piecing the puzzle together, I might notice things that need to be adjusted in an area that I previously thought was finished. This is why I don't call my paintings finished until I've got all of the painting in. I can then sit back and look at it at more of a distance, and I can then visualise whether or not anything needs to be tweaked. Now, when painting spaniel ears, one of my biggest tips here is just to focus on the main shapes that you see. Again, for the size of this ear, I can't add in all of the individual strands of fur, but I can certainly hint at that and get a very high level of realism. When I'm working with my glazes to adjust that fur colour, it's really important to make sure that that layer has allowed to dry. You can see there that I've come in with another lighter layer to enhance more detail, waited a couple of minutes for that to dry before again going back in with a glaze to adjust that colour. Now, this layering process can simplify this painting of any subject far more easier. We can become very overwhelmed with worrying about what colour to mix at each individual layer. But the wonderful thing about working with acrylics is we really don't need to do that. We can split it up in the way that I've shown here, and as I've mentioned, that glazing video does cover all of that thoroughly. Now onto the body here, and I'm going to be using the same layering process. I personally like to use my smaller brushes for a painting like this. It just means I'm less likely to block in one solid colour. You can see here that where I've got any difference between my lights and my darks, I've captured that here. Now I find that one of the things that can really help getting this level of softness for a base layer is that I work on really small sections so that by the time I come back in with a light or dark colour, the area next to it is still wet. Now I feel that getting this softness to the base foundation makes a huge difference to how realistic the brushstrokes look when we start working with our details. And this is something that I really do focus my real-time tutorials on. Now, one thing that you can do if you are using a fine mist spray bottle, which obviously I was trying to avoid with this painting, but if you're feeling that your acrylic paints are starting to get a bit tacky, they are starting to dry before you've had a chance to blend them, then you can use a fine mist spray bottle and just put a light layer of water over your painting, and you can, if needed, keep those acrylic paints wet for hours. There is no reason why we can't then create more of that blended oil paint effect, but that is easier to do when using a fine mist spray bottle. Now, I will have more videos coming up in the next couple of months where I'm showing how to use a fine mist spray bottle to do that softer, even more out of focus effect. Now for this stage here, I'm using that same method where I'm applying water first. I'm then using a brush to apply my paint, and then here where I want it to be a little bit softer, you can see that I'm using a makeup blush brush to really create that out of focus effect even more. Now the makeup brushes that I'm using, I prefer to use those compared to a sort of acrylic mop brush, which is a similar looking brush, but I do find the makeup brushes don't drop the bristles as much, so you're not having to spend that time trying to pick those out of the layers of paint. Now when I'm working and building in a bit more of this solid area, you can see that anywhere where I'm trying to get that softness in the edge of that paint, I'm blending it right away. I don't want to then get distracted and start working on another section and then come back to expect that paint to still be wet for me to blend. If I do need to soften any of those edges, I need to do it at that time when using these techniques. And as I've just mentioned there, you can use a fine mist spray bottle if you want to have that paint to have much more of that slower drying time. You can then come back in, work on something for 10 minutes, and as long as you've sprayed with water at the right time and you keep on adding that water at the right time, there's no reason why that paint that you did apply first has to be dry. It can still be wet for hours later. Now, an issue that would happen here is if too much water is just continuously added to the canvas, you'll end up having the water run down your surface, which is something that definitely needs to be avoided. If you then try to use your blend-in brushes to blend that layer of acrylic paint, if the water is running down, then that makeup brush will just act like an eraser. That wet paint will lift off completely. So you want just about the right balance of water. You shouldn't have lots of that water in one area, which is why I personally like to hold the fine mist spray bottle further away from my canvas. I usually hold it a foot and a half away, so that when I do spray that water there, it's going to be a bit more of an even coverage rather than just one sort of hot spot of water where it's then likely to run down. Now these blending techniques work better when painting on a smaller scale. If I was working on a much larger canvas, something like a 16 by 24, these techniques are going to be far harder to work with because the water would have dried before we've had a chance to blend over that larger area. So for larger paintings, a fine mist spray bottle for me is a must-have. That's going to allow that paint and that water to be covered over a much larger area, which gives us that longer time to blend that paint over a larger painting. Now I am going to have tutorials that focus on that coming up over the next few months, because blending acrylics on a larger scale, it does require a slightly different technique than what I'm using here. But if we're newer to blending acrylics, all we do need to blend those smaller areas and we don't want to have to rely on a fine mist spray bottle, this here is a really good way of having that in-between technique that we can maybe gradually increase up to using that misting bottle. Now going back to the base layer for the fur and using those wet on wet blending techniques, as I start to come in here with more of my detailed brushes, you can see that this still has that degree of softness, and the reason being is I don't have any harsh edges for that base layer of fur. If I had harsh start and stop points between the lights and the darks, coming in with my details here, I'm more likely to follow those harsh edges. The fur can then start to end up looking flat, almost a bit squared off, because it doesn't have the softness in the transitions where the dark paint meets the light paint. So whenever I've got a dark or a light colour, I always want there to be a mid-tone in the middle, and it's that mid-tone that gives me that softness to where that colour does fade from one to the other. As I've started adding in the lighter brush strokes, you can see that once that's dry, I'm again using my same glazing process to adjust the colour. Now another reason why I like to use small brushes is it stops me from adding one solid glazed colour over the entire area. The one thing about aiming for realism is the same with values, the lights and the darks. The one colour is never going to be applied across the entire section of the animal. The way that that light catches the fur is going to give a variation of that colour. So in some cases here I've used more raw sienna for the lighter areas, and then I've used more burnt umber and burnt sienna for my darker sections. Having this variation, it just definitely adds more of that shape and form to the animal that we're painting. Now when I'm building up the fur here, I always try to visualise what's closest to the skin first and building up from there. It's usually going to give more of that depth to the fur rather than just jumping into the brightest highlights right on top of a base foundation. That can be something that can significantly limit the softness within the fur, so building up these range of midtones I find is really important. It's why I came back in and darkened that lower section of the white fur. By making that a little bit darker, my lighter brush strokes are going to be more visible, and this would be the case with any fur colour. If we're working with a lighter mixture for the details and they're not visible, that is an indication that the base layers aren't dark enough. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you would like to paint along to the real-time tutorial, then I'll link all of the information to that in the description below. And I'm going to be uploading another video at the end of the week. But as always, thank you so much for watching.